Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I have with me Suzanne Aitken, SVP of Managed Access at Clinigen. In this episode, we'll be discussing the role of managed access programs in the current pharmaceutical landscape. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thanks for your time today.
Now, as you probably know by now, listeners, before we dive into our central topic in these podcasts, I like for us to get to know our guests a little bit. So, Suzanne, please tell us more about yourself, including the journey that has brought you to this point today, doing what you do at Clinigen.
Of course. After my PhD, I was really driven to join the pharmaceutical industry, and I really viewed that as giving me an ability to combine my interest in chemistry, which was my PhD topic, with a real desire to, sounds very broad, feel like I have an impact on society. The first 10 years or so in my career was spent in R&D within large pharma, which certainly kept that chemistry focus, and I did feel like I was contributing usefully. In that time in R&D, before I joined Clinigen, I was very familiar with the R&D cycle, but really had no idea that outside of clinical trials, there were mechanisms that allow compliant access to medicines that were not yet approved. Through an old colleague, I was introduced to what I would view as a really niche part of the pharma industry. And seeing the patient impacts of what we do every day, I was hooked straight away. That's when I joined Clinigen, and here I am today, kind of 12 years on. My role within Clinigen is now leading the Managed Access business unit. We support pharma and biotech clients of all shapes and sizes, supporting access to critical medicines. And Clinigen as an organisation have been around for a long time, so more than 35 years experience, and have an unsurpassed pedigree in developing and delivering early access strategies for many of the most innovative medicines that have been developed and kind of got out there in the marketplace over that time. We're a large team of experts in the early and managed access space, and I'm incredibly proud of what we do to support those pharma and biotech clients. And ultimately, everything that we do is about supporting those clients provide access to patients that have a desperate need for access to medicines.
Absolutely. Thank you, Suzanne. Now, most listeners will know, but let's, just in case some listeners don't, managed access programs, or MAPs, enable mechanisms for patients with unmet medical needs, as Suzanne has been explaining, to get access to new medications outside of the clinical trial setting and well before marketing authorisation and reimbursement in a patient's country. Also referred to as expanded access programs and early access programs, these programs are not limited to the United States. Indeed, most countries around the world have a defined approval process for a treating physician to apply for access to an unlicensed medicine. The challenge, however, is that regulations, guidelines, and terminology will vary considerably from country to country, making it difficult to navigate and understand what is available and what is not. Now, managed access programs, as we've been explaining, are critical for patients who often need medicines that are unlicensed in their region, and MAPs are often the only way of getting them the treatment they need. And this is particularly applicable for rare disease patients. So, Suzanne, I was wondering, could you perhaps tell us more about MAPs in general, but also more about the role of MAPs in rare diseases?
Of course. And maybe I'll answer the second part of that question first. So you've described really well there the complexity, the challenge of the regulations that exist around the world. We use managed access as an umbrella term to describe the supply of medicines outside of a clinical trial setting and outside of normal commercial supply. That is typically before the product's approved, either globally or locally in the patient's market. But what links those regulatory mechanisms, they are different in all of the territories around the world, as you've alluded to, but what links that is that commonality about unmet medical need. And that really is why it is so critical in the rare disease space. It is equally valid in many other therapeutic areas, the managed access provision mechanisms. But obviously in the rare disease space, we typically will be seeing, so we are seeing products being developed which are targeted for very small populations who may be very spread geographically, and fundamentally commercialization can be really difficult in those settings. So really important in the rare disease space, both because of the level of unmet medical need, but also the potential timeline to enable normal commercial supply to those patients. And that may simply not be commercially viable in all territories. Going back to the broader, what really is a managed access. So in practice, a managed access program is there to cover everything that's needed to supply that critical medicine that's needed, and to get it all the way from the manufacturer all the way to the hospital, wherever that patient will be being treated. That includes many different things. So storing medicines in appropriate locations around the world. In some cases, labeling products with special labels that define the mechanism of supply. It generally will mean supporting the healthcare professionals who are requesting access for their patients with both the request process, but also the regulatory approval steps that are needed, which are individual to the unlicensed regulations in their territory. We sometimes need to screen patients to make sure that they are suitable, that they're eligible to have the supply through the managed access program. And finally, we need to safely ship that product from the storage locations where we look after the product all the way to the hospital or pharmacy so that it reaches the patient. And really, that complexity is what makes this, for me, an incredibly interesting space to operate. But the complexity in the regulatory environment and the practicalities is really where organizations like mine come in. We have some organizations that we work with who understand the regulatory side fairly well, but fundamentally are not set up to support those practicalities, which are different when we're talking about unlicensed supply compared to traditional commercial supply, which is normally what pharmaceutical companies are set up to deliver. So very, very complex areas to navigate, which leads into then some of the challenges that we're there to help address.
Thank you, Suzanne, for broadening our awareness, my awareness, certainly, but perhaps some of our listeners as well. So talking about awareness, sadly, there's an awareness gap, isn't there? I mean, Clinigen's own focus group research has previously found there is this wearing gap in how many patients with unmet needs are aware of MAPs and therefore can't even ask their healthcare provider for alternative options because they don't know there are alternative options. So I was wondering, without naming names or specific medications, can you tell us more about this?
Of course, and I absolutely agree. There is a huge lack of awareness, and I think that goes across the landscape as a whole. So that starts with patients, and sometimes they're representatives. Some of these rare disease patients, for example, are children. So the patients' families, but also the healthcare professionals and the broader industry as a whole. There is a significant lack of awareness around what is possible. So how can medicines be provided through non-traditional routes? Everyone is very familiar with how we access medicines through commercial supply chains. So products which have been approved and are commercially available. Then our physicians understand that those treatments are there and therefore will prescribe for their patients. Patients are becoming increasingly aware, really through the internet, and the rise of information that is out there about products that are either available or in development. But what people still really don't have a good understanding of is just that mechanism. So it is possible. So they don't necessarily have to wait until the product is approved in their territory. There may be appropriate mechanisms that access can be quicker.
Thank you. So it seems that there is sort of not so much an awareness gap as a missing educative gap, perhaps. So I was just wondering while you were speaking why this might be so, and also what role could, say, governments or government agencies play, as well as those healthcare providers and pharmaceutical companies who are aware of these mechanisms when it comes to broadening awareness, perhaps through educative means, and getting to a state where we have a democratized landscape of access to treatments? What would be needed to help that eventuate?
Great question. And I think, as is often the case, there are many different prongs to how we can try to address that gap in awareness and education, to really help support that democratizing access, as you described. I think that the responsibility for that education and awareness, for me, really lies across the whole of the pharma industry. It's a kind of system level awareness issue. There is definitely a place for organizations like mine where we can be educating parties of the pharma world, in all of their different guises, of what's possible to support access being facilitated to those patients who are most in need. Pharma companies themselves need to make sure that their customers can find out information about options, so that there is easy access for physicians about available clinical trials, what medicines are available through, for example, managed access schemes. Doctors and patient advocacy organisations and specialist consultancies who are out there, obviously a really important part of what they do in their day-to-day is continue to build their awareness of R&D that's happening kind of in their focus areas, but also what mechanisms of access. Because as I said, it is one thing to know that a product is perhaps approaching approval, but it is a second layer that needs to be understood, which is it can be possible to prescribe before the product is commercially available. And fundamentally, patients and carers, I alluded to it previously, are becoming more and more familiar with accessing information about new treatments, so that they then start to have different conversations with their treating physicians. What I would say, though, is that as an industry, we need to make sure that that information is clear, is suitable for a layperson to read, because that needs to be in clear language that's understood. But we also need to make sure there are a huge amount of internet resources which are incredibly helpful. But as in any field, there's a huge amount of information out there that may not be very accurate. So us having industry-driven and industry-wide communication processes, for me, is an important part of that education process.
Yes, certainly misinformation in this field could be an entirely separate podcast, so we won't go too far into that dark avenue. But I do have a last question. What takeaway would you like to leave our listeners today when it comes to what we've been discussing, managed access programs or MAPs, and the current pharmaceutical landscape that we are both living in and, without being too specific, awakening to in the near future?
Sure. So I think the pharma world that we live in now is continuing to evolve. I'm sure it will continue to as we move forward as well. We've touched on the importance of rare disease, but fundamentally, as we understand disease better, as an industry, we're increasingly developing medicines targeted at smaller groups of patients. That, from a patient perspective, is a brilliant step forward, and that gives much more hope for individuals who historically have been underserved by medicines that have been being developed. But it does create different challenges for the pharma industry, because the launch planning for a rare disease or a cell and gene therapy is very, very different to the historical traditional launch planning of a blockbuster type product, a very large product. That does mean, for me as an industry, that we need to be much more inventive about how we use all of the options that we have in front of us to support both the commercial viability of the products that are being developed, because ultimately that's what then fuels the next products being developed, but also inventive about how the patients can access medicine. And that's one area where I see managed access programs being a really critical part. And fundamentally, these types of mechanisms, they can be a long-term compliant supply route in some non-launch markets. Again, that awareness may not be there today, but I think we will see that continue to evolve.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
And that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podbean, and pretty much wherever else you download your other podcasts from. Just search for pharmaphorum and follow and hit subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.